Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland at 7. My name is Ruth Watson. My guest this evening is Professor John Robertson, known to many of you, I'm sure, for the Talking Up Scotland blog. John was a Professor of Politics of the Media at University of the West of Scotland, UWS. Before I come to John, I'm going to go through the headlines and then we'll get into the meat of the day. Ukraine update, day 399. Volodymyr Zelensky has said that Russian President Vladimir Putin is an informationally isolated person who has lost everything over the last year of war. Humza Yousaf has been sworn in as First Minister at a short ceremony of the Court of Session in Edinburgh this morning. First Minister Humza Yousaf has unveiled his cabinet team with 5 members aged under 40 and, for the first time ever, a majority of women. The SNP has warned the UK government against yet another false dawn on carbon capture investment after a decade of broken promises. And if I could just unstick this bit of paper. Jeremy Hunt has pledged to find additional money to help fund public sector pay deals after admitting that the UK's high level of inflation has made it impossible for Whitehall departments to end strikes without Treasury support. UK Immigration Minister says asylum seekers will get the most basic housing possible. Asylum seekers will be housed in the most basic accommodation possible, including disused army bases and possibly ships, to save money and to dissuade people from coming to the UK, the Westminster government has said. The UK government has backed down over a refusal to publish sensitive internal government research into the effectiveness of benefits actions that has been kept under wraps by UK ministers for over 2 years. John Nicholson, the SNP MP for Oakhill and South Perthshire, has been cleared of allegations of bullying made by the former Cabinet Minister, Nadine Dorries, after a 6-month investigation. Well, after Scotland's epic match against Spain last night, the Scottish Greens have said too many people missed out on a historic night of football, with fans being locked out by a costly paywall. So, to come back to our guest this evening, Professor John Robertson, looking at Ukraine update, President Zelensky is suggesting that Putin's announcement that shortly after Xi's visit he would move tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, close to NATO territory, and that was meant to deflect from the fact the Chinese leader's visit did not go well. What do you make of? I'll go back over some of these statistics in a few minutes, but what do you make initially of the situation that we find ourselves in, or that Ukraine find themselves in, with Russia and sort of the increasing saber rattling and politicking of Putin?
Well, I think you said saber rattling there, and I think that's exactly right. This is saber rattling. There's no serious threat, I don't think, from the movement of tactical nuclear weapons into other parts of the east there. It's a tragic situation. It's one I have to say. You wouldn't think I'd be naive at my age, but I really didn't think this would happen. I didn't think he would invade Ukraine. I think he thought it was going to be over very quickly. His advisors told him that it was going to be over very quickly, and he's now trapped in another Vietnam, I suppose, for the Russians there. It's just appalling. A huge loss of life and no real reason for it, and it will come to an end. The Chinese, in the end, I think, will broker a deal of some kind. I don't know what that deal will be, but all wars come to an end, and despite the cost, the cost has been horrendous. They will come to an end.
I was watching a news segment yesterday which was saying that Mexico is doing tremendously out of this because America has stopped buying so many products from China. And you sort of wonder how much China's reputation as well as their economy on the international stage is going to suffer as a result of their support of Ukraine, or their tacit support of Russia.
I think that the Chinese support of Russia will have its limitations because of that. They're concerned about their economy, and I have to assume that at some point they will back off here because to protect their economy. As you say, other areas of the global economy, such as Mexico, benefit from this. The Chinese economy is huge. It's links with the US. The Chinese own a fair part of the US. I mean, I say this, and I know somebody will contradict me by saying the very same things were said in 1914, that the interlocking of the economies of Germany, France, Britain, and so on were so extensive that none would choose to go to war. It just would have made no sense to go to war, and yet we did. I have to think things are a bit different now in terms of awareness of economic links. So I've been accused in the past of being too optimistic, but I'm broadly optimistic that there will come an end to this. Chinese will probably broker it, and we're back to the situation we were in before.
When I lived in Asia for a number of years, in Southeast Asia, as the Chinese began their exercise in the Spratly Islands, sort of developing these two rocks basically into islands to try and do as they've done in the end was to try and claim that the South China Sea belongs to them, which would have huge political and economic ramifications. But then it was very much being discussed again in Southeast Asia, where people pay more attention to these things perhaps, that the demographic of the Chinese was such that there were going to be so many single young men because of the one-child policy and because of selective abortions, that that China actually would become more dangerous at this precise epoch because they would have so many young men who had no prospects of marriage, that the cynical were saying that China would have to find some way to saber rattle or enter some kind of conflict, perhaps over Taiwan, to try and find a way to occupy all these dreadfully sad young men who were never going to have a chance of finding a wife. Does that sound like
That's a,
a sort of a cynical, but I mean that was definitely the 15 years ago. That was the analysis
yeah.
that people then were saying. Do you think this is a risk to peace now?
It's an interesting thesis, and it's one that was used to explain the explosion of Islamic terrorism from the Arab world. That was triggered by a population boom in the 1960s, and a population boom which created a large generation of young people with nowhere to go in terms of careers, or repressive Islamic societies or military dictatorships. That created a big, swollen population of young men, frustrated and angry, and that led to that being channeled through various forms of terrorism. I'm not sure that China is the same as the Arab world was then. I mean, China has massive opportunities, I think, for people in employment, in higher education, and so on, which the Arab world never had. So I wouldn't be so sure that will happen there. But it's clearly a risk. I mean, lots of young men can be a problem in any society. Too many young men with nowhere to go.
So, I mean, looking over again at what's happening in Ukraine, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Russia's mercenary Wagner Group, has said the battle of the eastern city of Bakhmut has practically destroyed the Ukrainian army, but admitted that his forces have been badly damaged. You've got Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Iryna Vereshchuk, has urged Russians not to adopt children who she said were stolen from their country during the war and deported to Russia. And certainly we're seeing absolutely horrific stories of children who were being returned from Russia and some of the terrible suffering that they've gone through there. And then we've, of course, got the potential of nuclear missiles being moved to Belarus. I mean, do you think that this is something which is part of Putin's increasingly desperate saber rattling? And do you think that in moments of desperation he will behave more erratically, and especially given the issues in Belarus, where the president there is deeply unpopular and is could hardly be said to be a democratic. I'm sorry, I've got a voice in my ear. I've got a voice in my ear correcting me that Lukashenko is not the president, but he is their leader. So apologies for any Belarusians listening for my poor grasp of international politics. But I mean, given those circumstances, do you think that the West is facing an increasingly dangerous Putin?
Um, things are so complex there. You have to be extremely arrogant and also extremely stupid to think I know what's going to happen here. I mean, it is. I really, like most of you out there, I have no idea really what's going to happen. I have a feeling. I have a feeling based on history that we have kind of peaked here. The situation is appalling, and and it is essentially a civil war. The Ukrainians and the Russians, although they might be angry with me saying this, are a very similar people in terms of, language, ethnicity, culture, and so on. This is a civil war, essentially, and civil wars tend to be horrific, tend to be far worse than other wars. But at some point, at some point, societies feel that enough has happened, and they will at some point, I think, back off, and the leadership will change. I mean, Putin won't last forever. Doesn't look a well man to me. He looks a very sick man, I'd say. So that something can happen quite suddenly that will change all of this. And so don't lose hope is my view. Um, you know,
Well, hope seems to be something that Ukrainians, hope and determination is something that Ukrainians seem to have in
yeah.
remarkable bucket loads. So Humza Yousaf has been sworn in as First Minister at a short ceremony at the Court of Session in Edinburgh this morning. Humza Yousaf, the newly nominated First Minister, took the oath of office. The official declaration is the final stage in Humza Yousaf being granted the title of First Minister and Keeper of the Scottish Seal. He pledged allegiance to the King as well as to serve him in the office of First Minister. The oath was administered by Lord Carloway, the Lord President, who heads up the judiciary in Scotland. Lord Carloway told the new First Minister, "A successful democratic system must be governed by the rule of law and can only exist if the government affords adequate protection to the judiciary from unwarranted attack." I thought that last was very interesting, John, that I was watching it with great interest as a very thoughtful Lord Carloway. I thought he obviously had paid great heed to what Humza Yousaf, the new First Minister, had said in his acceptance speech. And I thought it quite significant that he make mention of the importance of the independence of the judiciary. What was your view on the whole day's proceedings?
Well, again, there's a great deal to respond to there. I mean, broadly speaking, I'm pleased. I think for me, and I think for most of the electorate, I think the key thing in the popularity of the SNP, apart from the independence argument, which is obviously central, but the other thing that really matters is that the SNP have become dominant because of the cleverness, or I have to say, of Alex Salmond in leading them around the Labour Party to the left. We must stay. I should say I'm an SNP member, so I won't criticise our two candidates at all here. That has been essential, and so Humza Yousaf has made it very clear he's committed to progressive taxation and indeed broadening taxation, wealth taxation as well as just income taxation, and he's committed himself to the achievements of the previous First Minister in areas such as the child payment and introducing the Scottish social security system, which will be much kinder to, for example, people like the disabled than indeed that WP has been in the past. And we're going to come to that. So I'm broadly pleased with that. And your point about the judiciary, clearly important. I mean, Scotland has survived, and to the extent it has survived because of its independent education, its independent health service, and its independent judiciary. Although not quite as independent at times as they should have been. I don't always trust the judges. They come from a very narrow social background, even in Scotland, and I think we've got some problems with that in terms of their class allegiances. But at least they are to some extent independent, and they of course they value that independence because it's their career and their sense of identity. So broadly speaking,
It was interesting also to see that that Lord Carloway seemed to be, to my ear anyway, saying that they also were committed to protecting devolution. That seemed to me quite an interesting point. I mean, it was almost as though there was echoes of the dog whistles coming from Westminster that they were responding to.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I agree with you, and I mean, as I said already, I mean, Scotland has survived because of the independence of its institutions, and the judiciary are important in that. Obviously, the church was tremendously important in the beginning in terms of Scotland maintaining a degree of independence. I wouldn't personally overplay the role of the judiciary in Scotland. I don't think they're not our shock troops. When it comes to the fight for independence, I think they'll sit on their horses on the hillside like the aristocracy have always done.
Yes, sitting on the hillside, watching what's going on, which direction to run in. But yeah. I mean, the significance of it is remarkable. I mean, the I was speaking I'm half Algerian and half of my family is Muslim, and I was speaking to some of my relatives in Algeria last night and today, and they absolutely are keyed. I mean, totally know what's going on. Absolutely stunned and so impressed that we have, that as a nation, we have elected somebody who is a second generation Scot, who is who's a Muslim, somebody who one of my relatives was one of my sisters was saying that if that she lives in Canada, she said if that happened over here there would be riots in the street, and she said it's just the potential there, the potential for everybody, doesn't matter what you look like, then you can, I mean that message wasn't lost on them. And one of my brothers this morning said that he had noted that the first thing that that Hamza Yusuf had done was to write to to Rishi Sunak, asking for independence, asking for a referendum. And so it seems to me as though within 24 hours, Hamza Yusuf has helped engage Scotland people internationally about the politics of what is happening in Scotland. Do you think that it will help our standing on the world stage further?
I think it could. Again, I wouldn't overstate that. I mean, I'm an atheist, thank God, um, and I'm a bit wary of people with strong belief systems. But I accept that in the kind of society we live in, that that there are people who have a faith, Church of Scotland or whatever, or Muslim or Hindu, and they can operate as professionals without being affected by that. I mean, I think it's quite an achievement for us as a society to have, as you say, in other countries there will be riots. So I think we've done well. I mean, I wouldn't for a minute suggest that this means we don't suffer from racism here. It's still here in abundance, but perhaps less so than in some other places.
Yes, I think you only have to look at what social media has been like today. Some of the comments the dog whistling from the likes of Murdo Fraser has been
Yeah.
actually really quite disgusting and offensive.
Oh,
But on to positive news. The
Don't-
First Minister
started
names
on
his
Murdo
cabinet. You'll notice I'm moving swiftly on. The First Minister names his cabinet. First Minister Hamza Yusuf has unveiled his cabinet team with 5 members aged under 40, and for the first time ever, a majority of women. In a cabinet of 10 that sees the economy established as a portfolio in its own right, Shona Robertson, the new Deputy First Minister, will take on the finance portfolio, including responsibility for the Scottish budget. Michael Matheson becomes Cabinet Secretary for NHS Recovery, Health and Social Care. Jenny Ruth joins Cabinet for the first time as a Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills. Mari McCallan joins Cabinet for the first time as Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Just Transition. Neil Gray joins Cabinet for the first time as Cabinet Secretary for Wellbeing, Economy, Fair Work and Energy. Mari Gudjon remains Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands. Angus Robertson remains Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture. Shirley Ann Somerville becomes Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice. And Angela Constance returns to Cabinet as the new Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs. Parliament will be asked to approve the new ministerial appointments on Thursday. Commenting, Hamza Yusuf said, "The cabinet team I have unveiled reflects the priorities that we will pursue as a government, including tackling child poverty, improving public services, and building a fairer, greener economy. Ahead of my appointment as First Minister, I have committed myself to a radical, ambitious, and progressive policy agenda for Scotland, and I know that this team is the right one to deliver it." When we're looking over some of those names, it's surely Shona Robertson as taking on the finance portfolio that indicates the new First Minister's commitment to the wellbeing economy and delivering social justice.
Yes, I noticed that too. I think that's a very good point, and I think it's very important. There's no doubt from opinion polls actually that if you tie the independence movement to the fact to Scotland, as well as being Scotland in the EU, which is popular too, that if you tie the independent Scotland to the notion of this kind of progressive, emancipated sort of form of economy, which is just not just about productivity, but it's about the quality of life for all of us. There's some fairly strong evidence in the polls that that's very popular, and might help us get independence, as well as being, of course, a very good thing in itself. So yeah, I was very pleased to see that.
And this sort of seems to me to be a bit of a double whammy for wellbeing, because Neil Gray is Cabinet Secretary for Wellbeing Economy. I mean, that's actually right in there. So you've got two people who have got a track record. I mean, it's kind of like a pincer movement, isn't it, of kind of like well-being in that you've got one person whose job it is to focus on the well-being economy, and you've got Shona Robertson whose political inclinations and track record show that this is something that she cares passionately about. And I mean, looking at some of the other cabinet secretaries here, it does make me wonder really what kind of a government we're going to see and what sort of junior ministerial appointments we're going to see tomorrow. What is it that when you're looking at this list of names, what highlights do you see for yourself? What makes you think, oh, let's see what they do?
Well, I mean, not to disappoint too much, I'm not much of a one for the importance of the personal attributes of leaders of that kind. They will have a team behind them, and one of the strengths of the SNP is that as a big successful party, it attracts young, talented people to work with the ministers, and so I mean, I've no reason to be disappointed with any of the appointments. I don't really know much about some of them. They all have a favourable impression on me, but I think what will really matter is the quality of the performance of the team that they're leading, and I'm pretty optimistic about that. And going back to something I touched on earlier, I do definitely detect that this cabinet sits very comfortably to the left of the Labour Party, and that means we win votes. Because we'll never take any more votes off the Tories, but the Labour Party is vulnerable to increasing SNP support, and it can only do that by being more emancipatory, more progressive than the Labour Party. And you might say, with Starmer and Sarwar, what could be easier than being more progressive than they are?
Yes, and yet you do sort of see some people, sort of saying, oh, well, if Starmer's in with a chance of winning in Westminster, then perhaps it's better just to get rid of the Tories to look at voting for Labour. However, when you look at, I mean, it's very hard for me to discern much difference in policy between the Labour Party and the Tories, although they do seem to try to talk a good game up here, no matter how much there are massive contradictions there. I mean, in terms of, for example, Keith Brown, who I think he's a deputy leader, he's a very personable guy. I kind of almost thought he might be the Minister for Independence. I mean, do you think this is a cabinet that is going to be effective in basically bringing everything back to saying, these are our jobs, this is what we're going to try and achieve for our people, but actually we can't do any of it without independence? How effective do you think they're going to be on their messaging, and how effective do you think they're going to be on delivering independence?
Well, that's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, and people will be groaning when I say this, perhaps. I mean, clearly this is not all about the SNP. The independence movement has been and is and should be a far wider thing. It needs to be a big popular movement. The Yes movement back in 2014 was a very impressive, passionate movement, incredibly broad and optimistic and lively, and we need to return to that. The SNP has a crucial role to play. The SNP is the powerhouse, the Scottish Government, the powerhouse of the movement, but they cannot be it all. We need far more than that. I don't really know about who should actually lead that. It doesn't have to be the First Minister by any means, or any leading member of the SNP. Someone else could be identified, and you could argue that the cabinet and the Scottish Government have a task, which I think all of the candidates pointed to, a task to govern properly, effectively, and the public obviously are concerned about cost of living, health service, and so on. So it's clearly very important that the Scottish Government, the SNP and government, get that right. Of course, we can do more than one thing at once. We can all do more than one thing at once. So I don't think for a minute they can't do that and push forward the campaign for independence. But I think it'd be quite important for that not to be something that's seen as being in the hands of the SNP on its own.
So perhaps the answer then is for the SNP to govern well, and for the Yes movement to be the ones that are actually sort of getting out and driving the agenda on the streets and talking to people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously helped by the SNP. I mean, the SNP has a presence everywhere and has money everywhere and has staff everywhere. So the SNP must play a big part in all of this. But it must be very clear to everyone that it's not just their campaign; it's all of our campaigns.
I was at a rally for when we were being taken out of the EU, sort of the 31st of January 2020. We had Kerry Muir had a 12-hour rally, and the Conservative son of the Conservative provost for our local council came and joined the rally for several hours because it was a party neutral yes rally, and Brexit. So it certainly seems to me that, as you're saying, it's while the SNP is the political, and the Greens and coalition are the political vehicle. It's we have to have that party neutrality in order for people to be won across. So, and I'm hearing the voice in my ear is telling me that Jamie Hepburn has been announced as Minister for Independence. So, watch.
Huh?
This is breaking news thanks to the Herald and the voice in my ear. So, let's watch this space and see what happens. That could be interesting days ahead. So, hopefully not from a false dawn to another. Here we have the SNP warning against the false dawn of carbon capture. The SNP has warned the UK government against yet another false dawn on carbon capture investment after a decade of broken promises. Amid reports the UK government will finally make a long overdue announcement on carbon capture this week, Stephen Flynn MP said the Scottish Acorn project must be funded fully and immediately, not years down the line. The SNP Westminster leader added the funding must be the first step in a major green growth package which must match the huge scale of US and EU investment and include match funding for the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund. It comes after a long line of broken promises from the UK government, which pledged £1 billion of funding for Peterhead in the 2014 independence referendum, only to pull the funding weeks after the vote. Scotland was snubbed again in 2021 and at the UK budget this month. Commenting, SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn MP said, after a decade of broken promises by the Tory government, there cannot be yet another false dawn on carbon capture investment in Scotland. The Scottish Acorn project must be funded immediately and in full. That means an announcement this week with funding delivered straight away, not years down the line. Scotland has been starved of green investment by Westminster, which is failing to match the huge scale of investment seen in the US and the EU. In addition to long overdue CCUS funding, the UK government must finally deliver a meaningful package of investment for green growth, including matching the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund for North East Scotland, he concluded. What's your take on the just transition and the future ahead for Scotland and our carbon capture investment? And actually, in fact, carbon capture itself, and how realistic is it for us to capture the stuff rather than just find other ways to stop releasing it?
Well, right at the end there, you've kind of made my point, or you've hinted at the point. I think carbon capture is a mirage. I think carbon capture projects across the globe have been massive failures, huge investment, very poor returns. And I don't know which figure of speech to use, mirage, red herring, or whatever. But I think, as you've suggested, we should be pushing on with green developments and trying to cut carbon emissions. Carbon capture just allows the carbon-based technologies to persist, to continue longer because we've got this kind of band-aid of reprocessing the output from them. I think have a look at the research. Anyone can have a look at the research. Tell you that carbon capture is a waste of time.
Now, there have been some really interesting projects going on in the Nordic countries, some apparently very effective methods of removing carbon from industries, but it seems to me that that is kind of like my approach to dieting, which is, if I'm doing one thing, then it means I can keep on doing the bad stuff as well. It's kind of like, it's like when you go on a treadmill, you can like eat a Twix. Okay, how many circuits do I have to do before I can work off the Twix? Actually, the answer is just stop eating the chocolate. You know what I mean? So if we're not going to do one, I mean, it's one thing to try and capture excess carbon once we've stopped emitting the stuff and all the other harmful gases. But it worries me, I guess, that perhaps people are being greenwashed and sort of the snake oil salespeople. And the other thing that really concerns me is the outsourcing. This kind of whole carbon offset. Basically, we're just shifting the problem somewhere else in the globe. What approach would you like to see in terms of serious measures that we can take to try and actually reduce the amount of carbon that we're doing? And is that active travel, investing in different ways of active travel, for example, or
Well, yeah, I mean, there are several things. I mean, I'm not, this is not my area of expertise. And what I've read about carbon capture is based on American studies. I didn't know there were maybe more positive interpretations from Scandinavia. Who would be surprised that the Scandinavians have done it better than the Texans in that sense? That's no surprise. Clearly, there are so many things we can do. I mean, we have made major achievements in the use of renewables in this country. We are way ahead of the pack in Scotland, and we can continue to do even more of that. I mean, some of the work with tidal power, I think, is very exciting. I mean, that looks like a tremendously effective thing. We could do something here about investing back in the railways, getting people off the road and into trains and so on. Obviously, there's hydrogen, there's various other technologies. Again, I'm quite optimistic. I think the Scottish Government has done a very good job on this within the limited resources that we have. And with full independence, I think we'd push ahead even harder. And I don't think we'd need carbon capture. And we certainly wouldn't need bloody free ports either.
Free ports are a huge concern, aren't they? It's again, having lived in
green or otherwise.
And seeing the impact of free ports, or the concerns about free ports over there, it's a huge concern. I'm actually really surprised that it's something that has been welcomed by the Scottish Government, or the previous Scottish Government, because it seems to be something that is so full of loopholes and serious problems. And you can say goodbye to a lot of the social justice that we're looking to see inside Freeport areas. It kind of just seems a bit like sort of gangster land. But that's just my own prejudice. Having
it may be, it may be that the Scottish Government's embracing of carbon capture and of free ports is because of media pressure. I think they may be scared to look at the research and actually say, hey, these are stupid ideas. But if you say that, then you get jumped on by the media.
I think the other thing that worries me, for example, about green hydrogen, is that it's very hard for green hydrogen to come into our homes, for example, because there's not yet an industry standard by which we can get it safely in, and obviously it does still require some methane gas to sort of act as a bit of a diluent. But the other thing is that in terms of everything going to electrical, sort of electrification seems to be the way ahead, and yet you look at what's happening in some of the nations where the minerals are coming from, and there's some appalling abuses of child labour and massive environmental pollution, as you're getting forests being stripped to get to the minerals below. So is this yet another example of how we promise ourselves solutions and end up creating a bigger burek in the process?
I mean, I've said already this is not my area of expertise, so I hesitate to say much more about that. I mean, things are just so complex. You do something in one place, and it affects something somewhere else. The politics is the art of the possible, and so I think the Scottish Government is going to be pragmatic about that, do what it can, and I think mostly they're doing the right thing, and perhaps with these new appointments, we'll see further progress in that direction.
Well, I guess some of the good news is that they've finally found a way of developing these huge wind turbines that now can be recycled. Because for a while everything up until now has sort of had to be buried in these great big wind turbine graveyards. But now, so that's some good news. So Jeremy Hunt promises extra cash to fund public sector pay deals. Jeremy Hunt has pledged to find additional money to help fund public sector pay deals after admitting that the UK's high level of inflation has made it impossible for Whitehall departments to end strikes without Treasury support. The Chancellor conceded that the only way the government could fund pay awards without cutting frontline services was if he provided financial support to Cabinet colleagues. Speaking to the Treasury Select Committee today, Mr Hunt dropped his previous insistence that pay offers for doctors, nurses and teachers would have to be funded by departments making efficiency savings. The Chancellor said that when the pay deals were completed, there would be discussions with the Treasury about the level of support. Making clear that the UK's annual inflation rate of 10.4% created special circumstances, Hunt said there would need to be a deal on how much of the cost would be borne by the Treasury and how much through efficiency savings and reallocation of departmental budgets. Additional Treasury funding would be expected to result in additional funding for the Scottish Government through Barnett consequentials. I mean, this is one of these stories that just makes you sit and shake your head, because on the one hand it sounds like good news, and on the other, I think we're back to smoke and mirrors. I mean, how can you have efficiency savings when people are already cut to the bone? And, I mean, in terms of the Barnett consequentials, it's just a bit more of our money coming back to us that we kind of previously would have seen disappearing down the hole to HS2, I guess. But I mean, what do you make of the current state that the UK's economy finds itself in, and the contortions indeed that journalists and broadcasters are tying themselves into, trying not to mention Brexit?
Well, again, you raised several points at once, and obviously Brexit is of course the issue that cannot be faced. I mean, Brexit clearly has triggered massive staff shortages in the NHS and in care services. No doubt about that. There are distinctions to be made, of course, between the situation in Scotland and that in the UK. I mean, the Conservative government has been desperate not to meet the quite justifiable demands for a reasonable cost of living increase of workers there. I think, ironically, that there is maybe some scope for efficiency savings in England in the public services, and particularly in the health service, where there's been a massive increase in managerialism and in outsourcing to private companies, and enabling, obviously the elite and the NHS, the consultants and so on, to make even more money than they were before. So it may well be, but the solution to the problem in England would be, of course, a Corbynite solution, I would say. Renationalise a lot of what they've privatised. The situation in Scotland is such that it's clear the Scottish Government is prepared to increase taxation, to find money for public services, and to pay decent increases to health workers. I think that's a solution. That's an obvious solution, is progressive taxation, so that you can pay for these things. It's what the Scandinavian countries have done for a long time. They pay high taxes, they get better services. None of them complain. None of the parties dispute that. The evidence is there, and I think we could probably do something similar here. I think there's very little chance that will happen south of the border. Under whichever of the two parties run the show, there is no way that they're going to move towards progressive taxation, because they'll just lose all the seats in the southeast. They're in a horrific situation there.
But you've got somebody like Rishi Sunak, who's got significant ties to private healthcare companies. It was one of the companies that he set up when he was in America, has significant dealings with private healthcare. And you look at the ethos of the sort of trickle down economics, sort of the crumbs off the table. It seems very hard to know what direction they can take, and they sort of seem to have boxed themselves in politically to a situation where everybody's a bad guy apart from them, and yet that kind of means that if the bad guys, suddenly the radicals are teachers and doctors and nurses and the Royal Mail workers. So where does England's politics go? Where does England's social contract go when we're looking in terms of the society? I mean, how can society continue to function when we're looking at the kind of inequities and the kind of pressures on people?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on the situation south of the border at all, but it may be, and people may criticise me for saying this, it may be that things there just have to get far worse, until then a party of the left emerges. I think they were quite close to salvation with Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn's policies were hugely popular. His policies on renationalising the railways and the energy companies, Conservatives were known to support that. But the media demonisation of Jeremy Corbyn stole England's chance to move towards a more caring society. And it's a huge tragedy. I mean, I have friends and relatives in England. Much regret what happened there. But it may be that given the Starmerite response is just to be like the Tories again, maybe just slightly better than them, but not so you'd be able to tell the difference. That's not going to work. That's clearly not going to work. So when Starmer wins, as he will win, he'll be in trouble instantly, and then they'll be back where they were. So it may be that England just has to, I'm afraid, suffer even worse catastrophe until people start to realise that they've been backing the wrong horses, two of them now, and that they need to look to the left, because they have a left in England. There are many talented left-wing politicians there who are out of the game at the moment that who can come back in, but only that can save them, I think, and back in the EU.
So what? I mean, what? Yeah. Well, I mean, sort of coming back to the story. We'll come to it, in fact, later on with the John Nicholson, because I think that actually this is. I think this is connected in terms of the power of the media and the power. I mean, the weakness of Ofcom. I mean, Ofcom saying GB News, it's okay for MPs, Tory MPs, to be on GB News because it's not a news programme. Well, apparently it is. If you look at anything online, it makes very clear it's a news programme. And when you look at the way in which the media has such a powerful hold on the narrative, I mean, looking today at some of the Scottish newspapers, we're seeing there was nothing at all about Humza Yousaf being First Minister. There was nothing at all in several of the newspapers on the front pages of this, this remarkable situation that Scotland found itself in, having, the first Minister from an ethnic minority, the first Minister from a Muslim background. And yet the story was about, basically SNP bad, or, Kate Forbes has refused, SNP in chaos. When we've got a media that drives a news agenda that actually seems not to be about news, but about something else, there seems often to be a subtext. And I'm not sure how we get back from that so that we can report, we're seeing actual news and actual facts for people to be able to make their minds up about the direction they want their nation to take.
Well, you've gone there into an area in which I kind of think I know a lot about, though not everyone would agree about that. I don't see much of a future for commercial or state media. I don't want to see a Scottish state broadcaster, and I don't like what the corporations do. It may be that people in your so-called professional journalists will criticise the citizen journalists of the social media, and a great deal of horrific misreporting takes place within social media. But much of the best reporting takes place within social media. Much of the most honest, direct, and radical reporting takes place within social media. So, as you said, we have these terrible personalised tales of Humza under pressure, that kind of thing, rather than celebrating what's been achieved here.
Well, I mean, looking to John Nicholson, the SNP MP for Oakland and South Perthshire, has been cleared of allegations of bullying made by the former Cabinet Minister Nadine Dorries after a 6-month investigation. Mr. Nicholson, the SNP's Culture Secretary, is understood to have been cleared after Parliament's Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, ICGS, assessed a series of tweets he made about Dorries while she was Culture Secretary in Boris Johnson's cabinet. Mr. Nicholson liked the tweets posted by others after the pair engaged in a Commons Select Committee session, during which he questioned Dorries on her use of Twitter. After a number of exchanges during the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee hearing in November 2021, she said she was not going to answer a question about tweets that I posted 12 years ago or whenever it was. At one point, Nicholson said, "It is hard to keep track of your tweets," to which Dorries replied, "Not as hard as it is to keep track of yours." A House of Commons spokesperson said Parliament's ICGS operates on the basis of confidentiality for the benefit of all parties. Therefore, we cannot provide any information on any complaint, including whether or not a complaint has been received. I mean, this does seem to come off the back of the remarkable spat where Nadine Dorries was somewhat humiliated during an evidence session she was giving about Channel 4 and her efforts then to privatise it. And there was quite a remarkable piece of evidence that she was giving, which was resulted in yes, but, and then. So, so do you think that this is connected? That we've got the media basically sort of being controlled and manipulated in terms of the remarkable series of appointments that have been made to the BBC, and now the UK government's attempts to privatise Channel 4, and John Nicholson seems to have found himself caught in the middle.
John Nicholson is a very decent man. I've never met John Nicholson, but I can tell from hearing him speak and the things he's said, the idea that John Nicholson has bullied anyone is just ridiculous. He's a fearless critic, and justifiably, but he's by no means a bully. I think there's a tendency sometimes for bullies to try and exploit anti-bullying legislation. That they're the very first people, the psychopathic bullies, will think, oh, here's a way I can attack someone. I'll blame them for being a bully. So it's just ridiculous. I haven't followed the story in any great detail. I'm not surprised that he's been cleared. And I mean, again, we return to the business of the quality of the media in this country. And the media in this country, generally speaking, the mainstream media, including Channel 4, is of quite limited quality. Some people will defend Channel 4 because it's better than the others, and I suppose it is. But they're really pretty shoddy. I used to, in the University of West of Scotland, I taught research methods. I taught, and in that I taught research methods to several groups, including journalism students. And one of the things I learned from the journalism staff was that young journalists, student journalists, first year, are expected to have two key characteristics in their writing. One is personalisation, the personal stories that attract people's interest. They help you understand how something would feel, but also contextualisation. That helps you to understand how big an issue this is, how widespread an issue this is it a changing issue over time, and so on. You fail in first year if you don't contextualise your story. The minute they go to work for the BBC or Channel 4, they drop it all. And it's all just shock stories about individuals and lies about bullying and so on. So, yeah, you've got me started here on the media, I'm sorry.
Well, being an old school journalist myself, I do like to rely quite heavily on facts. So, ministers back down over ruling ordering DWP to release benefit sanction study. The UK government has backed down over a refusal to publish sensitive internal government research into the effectiveness of benefit sanctions that has been kept under wraps by ministers for over 2 years. The Welfare Secretary, Mel Stride, told MPs on the Work and Pension Select Committee that he would not appeal against an information watchdog ruling earlier this month, ordering the Department of Work and Pensions, DWP, to release the study. Sanctions are effectively fines. The average sanction is £660, issued to claimants as punishment for infringing benefit conditions, such as not spending enough time searching for jobs or failing to attend meetings with job centre work coaches. Interest in the findings of the DWP report has intensified since the government announced in the budget that it would apply sanctions more rigorously as part of its plans to force more people back into the labour market. The DWP study was commissioned in 2019. After a Work and Pension Select Committee, the inquiry concluded, echoing comprehensive academic research, that while sanctions had little effect on getting people into work, they routinely impoverished claimants and damaged their mental health. Although the DWP initially pledged to publish the study, it emerged a year ago that then Welfare Secretary Therese Coffey had blocked its release. The Information Commissioner rejected the DWP's refusal to release the study in response to a Freedom of Information request, ruling that there was a strong public interest in scrutiny and understanding of the information available to those deciding whether to continue with a controversial policy such as sanctioning benefits. Announcing that the study would be published in the House of Commons today, Mr Stride defended his predecessor's decision to block publication. However, Mr Stride was put on the spot by questions on sanctions policy by SNP MP David Linden. Mr Stride admitted he had never knowingly met a sanctioned client and was unaware how much the average sanctions penalty amounted to. David Linden said he met people every week in his Glasgow East constituency who had been rendered destitute and mentally ill as a result of sanctions. He suggested Stride's understanding of sanctions was highly theoretical and removed from reality on the ground. He added, "May I gently suggest, Secretary of State, that if you look to get people back into work, plunging them into poverty and destitution is not a particularly good way of doing that." I mean, this is an absolutely staggering story, and the evidence given was absolutely astonishing. To think that an MP would never have met somebody who had been sanctioned, whereas my understanding is that many of the people who attend MP surgeries, generally speaking, are those who are in terrible straits, often because of government sanctions. What do you make of the story emerging, and how do you think it will be tackled by the media?
Well, the media coverage is one thing. I mean, I'm sure that at least the Guardian, I suppose, will cover it, and the others will probably try and conceal it. It's clearly the right thing to do. I mean, it's amazing that they thought they should cover this up. There are echoes here, of course, of the behaviour of the DWP in the past towards disabled claimants, and the association that they had clear evidence that the behaviour of the DWP resulted in multiple suicides, perhaps several hundred suicides amongst disabled people because of the brutality of the assessment. They farmed out, of course, the outsourced assessment system they had for the disabled there. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the mission of the Scottish Social Security process, which is being established at the moment. Early evaluations have been very positive about the level of humanity in that system, by contrast with the DWP. So I guess we're going to see the same kind of thing as we saw with the treatment of the disabled in the assessment in the past. We'll see stories of tremendous harshness and the consequences in terms of ill health. Perhaps, I hope it's not true, but perhaps we'll see there's evidence of suicides consequent to the behaviour of the DUP in this case too.
There have been some horrific stories of a mother of a young child killing herself because she had no food and couldn't feed her child and was scared the child was going to be taken from her. This is just one. I mean, it's one of those things that it's very hard to see how the mindset of the politicians works, because if they're trying to get people back into work, because we have a severely depleted workforce because of Brexit. They're talking about finding ways of sort of keeping pensioners back at work, which presumably is this whole thing about keeping the people working until 67 and then 68. And my goodness, I sometimes wonder if there should be a bit more of a French about us. But I mean, it's how and yet there's a disconnect. You've got these politicians who are being discovered as led by donkey in their expose, people who think that they're worth, £1,800 a day. So there seems to be something of a disconnect. At what point do you think people are going to really wake up and say enough is enough?
I think, I'll just get this out of my head straight away. And I think that the disconnect that you've identified there is the disconnect between the psychopath and the rest of the population. People will say I'm being simplistic here, but there are a significant number of psychopaths in any society. It's evolutionary, adaptive to be a psychopath. They rise to the top. They're in certain professions, and they're commonly in areas of politics and to the right in politics. These are people who don't care. They would never care. It wouldn't matter how much education they had. It wouldn't matter how many videos you showed them of starving people. They still wouldn't care. So there's only one way to deal with this, and that's for the populace to recognise that these are the kind of people you have stupidly elected and never elect them again. And I've lost track of what the question was.
Well, we're moving from one form of cruelty and psychopathy to another, she says, commenting in a way that perhaps I should not contextualise as a good independent journalist. The UK immigration minister says asylum seekers will get the most basic housing possible. Pardon me for extemporising, but as if they're not already, seriously. Asylum seekers will be housed in the most basic accommodation possible, including disused army bases and possibly ships, to save money and to dissuade people from coming to the UK, the government has said. In a common statement setting out the next stage in plans to reduce asylum claims in the UK, Robert Jenrick, the immigration minister, said the plans would meet legal requirements to ensure that those who arrived were not made destitute, but nothing more. We must not elevate the well-being of illegal migrants above those of British people, he told MPs. Jenrick's plan won praise from many of his MPs but was condemned by opposition MPs as an admission of failure, while two ministers have voiced concern about housing asylum seekers on military sites in their constituencies. Jenrick confirmed plans to house people at the disused defence base at Wethersfield in Essex, the RAF base at Scampton in Lincolnshire, an RAF site turned prison in Bexhill, East Sussex, and the Catterick garrison in North Yorkshire. Ministers were also continuing to explore the possibility of accommodating migrants in vessels, he added, after reports that refugees could be kept on disused cruise ship or barges. I mean, this really is, to quote Gary Lineker, misquote Gary Lineker, it's just like the rhetoric of the 1930s. Surely, how can decent people think that any of this is okay when there's no legal routes to claim asylum in the UK?
Yeah. Well, they say if you mention World War II, you mention the Nazis or the 30s and so on, some people say you've lost the argument as soon as you mention that kind of parallel. I'd like to go for another one, and that's that I think that this is inspired. This ideology, this idea that we can dissuade people from coming here by making them live in terrible accommodation is clearly derives, I think, from Monty Python's Four Yorkshiremen. You know, cardboard box in the middle of the road. You were lucky. We dreamed of a cardboard box in the middle of the road. It's just appallingly stupid and heartless and insensitive. And these are people who are out of touch. I've referred to them as psychopaths, and I'll do it again. These are people who have no idea of what it's like to suffer the kind of conditions these people have suffered getting here and even when they get here. I don't want to live in that kind of country at all, and I'm just shocked that so many people in the southeast of England continue to vote for these monsters.
It's that's one of those things that leaves me to mull and ponder quite at length. It's bad enough that there's politicians like that, but how do people vote for them? But the Scottish Greens say Scottish football must be for everyone, no more paywalls. The Scottish Greens have said too many people missed out on a historic night of football last night, with fans being locked out by a costly paywall. The party's sports spokesperson, Gillian Mackay MSP, has called for decision makers to keep the dressing room by coming together and doing everything they can to ensure as many people as possible can watch our beautiful game. Gillian Mackay MSP said, "Last night was a historic night for the Scotland's men's team and for Scottish football. It was a win that will be remembered and celebrated for years to come. The Tartan Army is the 12th man, yet far too many missed out on the celebration and were separated by a costly paywall. Sport should be inclusive and our national team should be for all of us. It's not often that we beat teams like Spain. If we want the children playing in the streets to be the champions of tomorrow, then they need to be able to see their heroes in action. This is particularly true when we are playing so well and could be on course for European action. If the SFA and the broadcasters want to keep the dressing room, then they need to work together and ensure that as many people as possible are able to watch games in the future without having to pay for an expensive subscription." Well, the cynic might say that perhaps the whole point is not watching our country succeed, but how do you think we can get sport back and available to all on TV?
Well, you've left till last, perhaps the thing that's made me most angry in the last 24 hours at least. But this has been around for some time, for quite a long time now. I can't remember how many years. We have people in Scotland have been unable to see the Scottish team play in games sometimes less exciting than that incredibly exciting one last night. And yet we can happily watch Wycombe Wanderers play someone on BBC Two of an evening. It's a scandal. I mean, I don't know how it's happened. It's beyond me how people have let it happen. You would think that even people, because there are so many football supporters in Scotland, many of them unionists, you think they at least would have said, "What's going on here? Why can't we watch our own team?" It's shocking, absolutely shocking.
Well,
and it's brought to a peak by this great achievement of beating Spain. And my goodness.
It was remarkable, and there is a petition out there for those of you who want to sign it. Well, that's it for this evening. My thanks go to Professor John Robertson, my guest for this evening. And before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. If you fancy being part of the team, you should always get in touch, because we're always looking for capable and competent young new staff. My name is Ruth Watson. Good night, and thank you for watching.